All I really know about Second Thought is that people say he is a tanky, and I've heard also people say that he is kind of a hypocritical guy, I guess, because I think he's this hardcore socialist, but then he's got another basically channel where he reviews luxury cars, which is kind of ironic. But he's a really big YouTuber. He's got, what is this, almost 1.5 million subscribers, only a few thousand away from 1.5 million subscribers. And he doesn't do videos just about socialism. I mean, if you look at his video catalog, why the U.S., under capitalism, why corporate America hates unions, why you should be a socialist, why is the U.S. media becoming right-wing, why you don't own anything under capitalism, why hearing both sides is dangerous, why you should get rid of intellectual property. So, broadly sort of capitalism skeptic, socialism positive videos, but not necessarily always just about socialism, right? Why the U.S. isn't a democracy. I'm sure that's a very well thought out video. And someone linked me this video, why social democracy isn't enough. And given that I'm a pretty big stan for social democratic systems and institutions and things like that, then I guess naturally people wanted me to react to this video. And so, let's do it. Let's react to this Second Thought video, why social democracy isn't enough. Let's learn.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, plus get access to our patrons-only Discord server and early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. A lot of people don't like talking about politics because they think it's too complicated. And if that's you, I don't blame you. The language of politics makes it incredibly difficult to understand what's going on.
What is this called, what he's wearing? I've seen people wear these, but I don't think it's appropriate to call this a cardigan because it's got buttons, but it's got the fabric of a cardigan. I think they're quite stylish, although I don't think I would wear one. So, let's see. Oh no, Morse code got completely wrecked. Spamming symbols. Look, I don't know why it's still saying you're spamming symbols. I turned that setting off, but maybe I need to revisit it. I'll do that after this video.
On the news, political words are very often misused or vaguely applied. Politicians identify with labels that don't describe them, and often reject the labels that do. Similar-looking words mean very different things. And to top it all off, political movements and the words they're associated with change and evolve over time. So a word that means something one day, 50 years later, might mean something else. That's the case for social democracy. If you've never heard the term before, that's probably because here in the States, we never use it. Instead, we tend to mislabel social democracy and call it socialism. Think Bernie Sanders or the Nordic countries in Europe. We know them as socialist, but according to most political textbooks and in just about every other country in the world, they're clearly understood as social democratic. There's a difference between these two things, and I'll get to why that difference matters in a second. But in case you don't watch the whole video, in just one sentence, the difference between socialism and social democracy is the relationship with capitalism that each philosophy advocates. For social democrats, capitalism is something that can be contained, reformed, or compensated for. Depending on the social democrat, capitalism is either a necessary evil or a genuinely positive economic model that simply needs to be reined in from its excesses.
So this is kind of true, kind of not true. This is the contemporary sort of use of the word social democrat. And this is true, right, that contemporarily social democrats are people that would defend essentially, fundamentally, private allocation of capital to some degree. Now, to be fair, I think that the Brunig analysis of it kind of is more so the expansiveness of socialist or capitalist institutions that's really important, and labeling an entire country as social democratic or socialist or capitalist is kind of wrong because, of course, there's pretty much every country has some sort of mixed model, right? China, Cuba have private allocation of capital in many different circumstances, right? And then obviously countries like America that are considered very capitalist, of course, have what we might call like a socialist institution or collective ownership or collective decision making, the postal service, the school system, things like that. Some people might include things like the welfare state, broad regulatory apparatuses, stuff like that, right? But I think this is something I don't really have a problem with so far, the framing of the video, which is that social democrats contemporarily, to distinguish them from actual socialists, tend to say that they tend to be less skeptical of private allocation of capital, at least in many assorted circumstances. Although, again, a social democrat like me would say that, things like sovereign wealth funds, good regulatory states, broad, expansive welfare programs, those are not socialist, but, I think those are things that a socialist and a social democrat would would agree on. I think that the big difference is how expansive the view on quote unquote socialist institutions should be in the economy. So let's see if second thought really gets into that.
And guided in a positive direction. In contrast, for socialists, capitalism is something that must be replaced by a fundamentally different economic model, one that is not driven by profit and in which production and distribution are organized democratically, not by wealthy and powerful individuals. The socialist goal is to transcend capitalism, while social democrats believe cleaning it up is enough. It wasn't always like this, but since at least the 1959 Godesberg program was ratified by the German Social Democratic Party, social democrats have openly rejected the idea of replacing capitalism. In practice, that means
Well, I'd be interested to hear what his definition of socialism is, really, because again, it's within reason. Again, it's a spectrum kind of thing. Sure, you might have a cutoff of where you call something a mostly socialist economy, or essentially a socialist, or essentially a capitalist economy. But I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on like the Norwegian model with pretty broad unionization, worker democracy within corporations, which would be unionization and worker board membership, cooperative organization, things like in Finland and in Norway, and then obviously just the literal collective democratic ownership through sovereign wealth funds in Norway. I'm just, without his definition of what socialism is, other than just a thing that's different from capitalism, it's kind of hard for me to really understand the big issue with certain models or certain advocacy, because if he's just saying the problem with social democracy today is that it doesn't advocate for replacing capitalism, okay, but what does it mean to replace capitalism, right? I'm not sure. I really don't know what that means. Without knowing what he means by that, I can't really say if that's a real problem, quote unquote, for social democracy with his sort of viewpoint. Hey, Kind of Boy, I'm a new reviewer, but I've been really enjoying your stuff. I'm curious if you've read about participatory budgeting at all, and if so, what are your thoughts about it? I think I know what you're talking about. I'm not sure if I've ever heard of it called participatory budgeting, but like democratic planning, I think is more or less what you're talking about. And I think that to some degree this could be okay, right? When you're talking about, say, allocating resources to schools and stuff, and having some democratic participation and advocacy there, that makes sense. But again, I think that broadly there are many markets where just having a private actors interacting in a market is probably fine. Food seems to be a good example of that. Clothes seem to be a pretty good example of that as well. So
that a social democratic country has a capitalist economy, one where the vast majority of productive businesses are owned by just a few people, and profits are businesses' animating drive. This is balanced out by a robust welfare state, safety net, and/or universal public services in health and education. A few utilities and industries especially prone to monopoly may be nationalized, and sometimes even operated by the state. There is wealth redistribution from the wealthy to the poor through taxation, and generally the economy is regulated through indirect means like subsidies or taxes. These are all things that socialists give critical support to as ways to ameliorate capitalism in the short term, but that we don't consider to be nearly enough for the actual end goal. This video will explain why. If you're a social democrat.
Okay, so it's interesting. So he's called out. He said nationalization, regulation, redistribution, welfare statism, stuff like that. The markers of social democracy. That is good, he says, but it's not enough. So I guess we'll learn what is the enough that would qualify under his definition of socialism and sort of his ideology.
Someone who supports Bernie Sanders, AOC, or looks to countries like Sweden and Denmark as models for what the US could be, odds are we see eye to eye on a lot of things. We most likely agree on social justice, our criticisms of laissez-faire capitalism, and on a number of political issues from climate change to abortion to workers' rights. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why I specifically advocate for socialism on this channel and not social democracy. It's not to be dogmatic or sectarian or to throw away pragmatism, nor is it to have a book measuring contest to see which of us is the most left-wing and call that a victory. It's because the historical record, political theory, and our present context all show that when it comes to the goals we share for a more egalitarian, just, and sustainable world, capitalism isn't something that we can rehabilitate. It always fights back, and when it's kept on a leash instead of being replaced, it always wins. In other words, social democracy is too unstable and incomplete for the results we're all looking for. First, the most basic objection that we socialists have with social democracy is that it's still capitalism. That may be obvious, but just to remind you, capitalism is an absurd economic system, where a tiny, unelected minority of people get the vast majority of people to work for them so that they can get wealthier. Due to the inherent nature of capitalism, a few people own an ever-shrinking number of companies, and everyone else fights over the crumbs that fall off the table. Even in social democracies, the vast majority of people don't elect their boss. They don't have a say in the decisions that affect whether they have a job or not, and their work makes that unelected, unaccountable guy richer. For an ideology...
Well, I agree and disagree with this to some extent. I think that market concentration, could be a problem even in a market socialist system. You'd still need a government apparatus to control whenever potentially a company becomes too big and large and starts taking advantage of its size, the incentives to do so, to become big and large and to take advantage of your size, I don't think that goes away even in a horizontal cooperative where the workers essentially democratically control the company. I mean, again, there's simple incentives there that don't change, and so you need that government apparatus, that sort of broader democratic accountability in an economy to ensure that that doesn't happen. Antitrust, I mean, Rocco, exactly, right? You need antitrust systems in a market socialist or in a capitalist system, sort of social democratic system. And when he says that, in the vast majority of these social democracies, workers don't elect their boss, I think that's kind of misleading in the sense that, I would say that if a worker is represented 50-50 on the board of directors and also has pretty robust union protection, I think that those are both pretty important democratic structures in the workplace, right? Sure, you might not have like a vote on who the manager is, but I think that when you have a democratic union that's representing you and worker board membership, I mean, those are pretty important democratic structures in the workplace, and the utility of having private capital in the workplace can be in the form of additional growth. It can be in the form of additional expertise. It can be in the form of insulated risk making from workers. So it's interesting that when workers in the Nordic countries have worker board membership, it's an option to them. They don't actually have to elect workers to the board. And in fact, a significant portion of workers in the Nordic countries don't actually choose to put members on the board, oftentimes because they have good union representatives already. So it seems like workers, when given that option, don't even oftentimes choose that option, very likely because of the implications of risk, because of oftentimes the utility of their union, right? So I'm not sure if I agree that that's necessarily a problem, or in fact that in social democratic countries, those types of democratic institutions in the workplace don't exist.
With democracy in the name, social democracy notably fails to provide democracy in the place where you spend most of your waking hours. High unionization and tripartite negotiations between the state, capitalists, and labor make that better than under a pure laissez-faire approach, but they still only balance the scales between the one guy at the top of the company and the 99 people who work there. They don't actually account for the number of people on each side the way democracy would. They only make sure that the one guy doesn't go too far and still gets most of the money. And regardless, people in any capitalist society are bound to the profit motive. So the decisions workers make in this marginally better situation, even if they had full democratic agency, still need to produce a profit for their company and their economy. So the typical capitalist...
So it seems like he's also saying that in his socialist model, the profit motive would be completely done away with, but I'm just not really... I don't really know of the utility of that. It seems like the profit motive is a pretty good way to incentivize innovation and growth, and it seems like, I don't know, at least in my experience, it seems like most contemporary socialists don't have a problem with the profit motive. It's more so who gets the profits and how those profits are distributed and regulated. And so it appears that he's taking a more, again, a much more classically socialist approach where you have not only democratic control of the economy, but also a lack of profit motive, which seems very hard to defend empirically. So.
Race to the bottom still applies, as everyone tries to outcompete for higher profit margins. But that's domestically, where workers' exploitation is relatively low and compensated for by a good safety net and universal amenities. Salaries in social democracies are high and public services are great. The problem with social democracy is that in order for capitalists to make good profits under this arrangement, where they pay their workers slightly better and don't get to hoard as much, somebody somewhere needs to be exploited a lot more. And that's where the global south comes in. For social democracies to provide their citizens their...
All right, I guess I can somewhat preempt this argument, somewhat classic socialist argument. The only reason that these social democracies are so great is because they terribly, terribly exploit the global south, which isn't really true. I mean, every paper that has tried to quantify this number, this amount of exploitation, what proportion of the economy is based on exploitation or wage differentials in the global south, it turns out it's very small. And in the papers where it purports to be a very large portion of the economy, the methodologies are very, very bad. And so it doesn't seem obvious to me that, yes, we have a perfect accounting of suffering and quality of life, where if one person over here's quality of life is high, that means one person over here's quality of life must be terrible. That doesn't seem to be how the world or the economy works, but we'll see how he tries to justify that belief. Perhaps it's very well founded in the research that he's done, but I just haven't been able to find that personally. And in the areas that purport to find such a fact, it seems like the methodologies are pretty suspect in those papers.
Their high standard of living and capitalists their profits, the global poor need to be taken advantage of.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. Rocco, well, it's definitely true that to some extent that Nordic countries benefit from cheap labor. No, that's, Rocco, of course that's true, right? To some degree, because people in Bangladesh and India and Vietnam make less money, the products that they sell to the global north and developed countries are going to be cheaper. To some degree, that's true, right? But the question is, to what degree, right? And if that degree is actually relatively small, then the argument that Second Thought is about to make is, it's not a bad thing to point out. Exploitation in trade definitely exists. Slave labor conditions and indentured servitude and like very, very bad negative working conditions exist in especially poor countries. That's true. But if it's a small portion of the economy, the prospect of reforming our way out of that circumstance is actually very obtainable. However, if you were to say that, oh no, half of our GDP or, the price of our goods is 10% as much as they would be if we paid Mexican farmers a fair wage. Well, if that's the case and everything would become 10 times more expensive and qualities of life would, decrease by 50% if it were the case that we paid everyone a reasonable wage and gave them union representation, things like that, well then the prospect of solving that under a capitalist framework would be very, very, very difficult, right? But my argument is that those things exist, but they're not so big a part of the economy that they are seemingly insurmountable to overcome. Roka says, well, you say small, but even 5% would be a considerable amount in my opinion. Well, sure, but even if it was, to say 5%, sure, let's say 5% of GDP is based on this sort of exploitative relationship. Well, I mean, if we got rid of that tomorrow, that would be a very bad recession, right? But it's not something that would fundamentally be irrecoverable. I think that that's the argument that many socialists make, is that, well, if under a capitalist system just could not survive if it were the case that everyone would make a decent wage and have sort of union representation for workers. I'll use a basic example, right? Why do people buy raw materials from Australia? Australia is one of the biggest raw material exporters in the world, right? Even though they have pretty good wages for mining workers and decent representation for mining workers, right? If they're making good money in the mining sector in Australia, why does anyone buy from there? Well, it's because it turns out you can still have a pretty good price for your goods, even if you're paying your workers a decent amount, right? So, but anyway, this is all before Second Thoughts even laid out his argument. So let's see what his actual argument is for this fact, I suppose. This fact that the social democracies are fundamentally underpinned by their ability to exploit labor from the global south. How does he justify this view?
Let's talk about H&M for a second. H&M is a Swedish brand known for shirts that say stuff like, "My other car is Bing chilling."
I got a feeling I know. I've got a feeling I know how he's going to argue this. So it's going to be very unsatisfying, I think.
And shockingly, other horrible decisions. H&M is, of course, the second largest fashion retailer in the world, with profits in the billions of dollars. And to achieve that status, the company relies on the cheapest labor it can find. Its wealth is built on the extremely polluting fast fashion model, which is the clothing world's version of planned obsolescence. It's been found guilty of greenwashing on multiple occasions, contracts from factories that sure do seem to catch on fire a lot, and of course it doesn't pay its workers a living wage. Something it promised to do back in 2013 when people found out, but come 2018 when H&M said it would have sorted all this out, the company hit us with the classic freshman year economics, what even is a living wage? No, really, the company said there is no universally agreed level for living wages, and then it kept paying its workers like garbage. I'm using H&M as a recognizable example here, but this kind of behavior is by no means unique to this brand. The problem with social democracy is that Swedish workers would never be treated the way H&M treats its workers in the global south. But it's okay with it happening to workers employed by a Swedish company somewhere else in the world. And thanks to the fact that it does, people in Sweden get cheap clothes, and the taxes on the company back home allow the government to provide great public services. Now, this isn't different from any other
Yeah, so I really hate the way he's arguing about this, because he's made the argument that, like, social democratic countries, like, there are countries in this world that their entire systems would be upended if we got rid of this exploitative relationship with workers in the global south. But now he's very much narrowed the scope of his claim to, well, maybe not the whole country of Sweden, but this one company in Sweden would have a hard time selling a competitively priced clothes if they didn't take advantage of their workers in these factories in other countries. But again, the problem is that we can point out sort of individual examples of how that could be the case. For instance, iPhones might become significantly more expensive without terribly exploited Chinese labor. That's true. That's fair, right? That's an example of a localized problem within a company that they would have to apologies that they would have to overcome. But what that's not evidence of is the idea that the entire country of Sweden would be completely fucked if they really, really reined in corporate use of global South labor, right? That's not, that doesn't logically follow from what he's examined here. But let's see if he broadens out the argument at all.
Capitalist country, mind you, it's not a problem unique to social democracy, and that's the point. Social democracy is built on the principles of justice and egalitarianism, but the fact that it benefits from exploitation and imperialism, particularly of this kind, shows the limits that a social democracy runs into when it agrees to follow the rules of global capitalism, which it has to. Like other capitalist countries, in order for the line to consistently go up, wealth needs to be extracted from poorer countries. If you want to learn more about that, I did a whole video on it a while back, and the Marxist Project also has a really great summary of the different ways capitalist imperialism works. But let's shift the focus back to the domestic situation.
Man, okay, that's just such a poor part of this video. He really gives almost no concrete examples or arguments. I mean, he uses the example of H&M, but again, like it's the equivalent of saying like, oh, if Nestle didn't hurt workers in the global South, then that would mean that the U.S. economy would collapse. Like, well, obviously that's not. Nestle could go bankrupt and disappear tomorrow, and I don't think that the fundamental system of the American economy would go away. I mean, the same thing with H&M. So I kind of have a problem with the way that he's trying to justify the statement that the social democratic countries are fundamentally reliant on labor from the global South. There's no evidence cited. He mentions one company that's been found to abuse workers in the global South. Okay, that's bad, right? But the argument isn't that doesn't exist. I mean, even someone like me, I would say that there's a ton of examples of workers in the global South being exploited, and you need to have international labor rights treaties in order to rectify that kind of situation, which we've done before. It appears that capitalism is able to create circumstances like that, and so insofar as you're able to do that, that seems like a pretty good solvency of that problem. But even if you were to say overnight, let's get rid of all these exploitative relationships, I'm not sure it would result in a complete collapse of global capitalism, because the issue at large is just how big a proportion of the economy is these types of relationships, and it just doesn't seem like it's a very large portion, right? Again, anyone who's ever tried to aggregate something like that has found that it would be a relatively small portion of the economy, and again, in the circumstances where they find that it's a large portion, well, the methodologies are quite bad. So it's difficult to make that claim, but he's moving on, so I guess we should as well.
Another reason that socialists aren't social democrats is because in social democracies, the power of the capitalist class must always be catered to, or society suffers the consequences. Under social democracies, progressive politics aren't gains made by the working class, but concessions granted to them by the ruling capitalist class that can be taken away at any moment. That's because...
See, I hate this argument, because I had this argument with Astar Bayer. Astar Bayer is a Marxist economics professor at, I can't recall what community college, but he's like a community college economics professor, and I had this argument with him. He basically made the same argument that, all these, social security, welfare, the universal healthcare systems in so many countries, those are just things that the capitalist lets workers get away with, right? And it's like, okay, but it seems like we're making two arguments. We're making the argument that the capitalist class is ultimately all powerful, and we must, as second thought says, we must cater all of society to the capitalist class, but also they hate all these welfare sort of social democratic reforms, and they're terrible, and they're going to take them away. And it's like, okay, but why haven't they taken them away, right? Why do we still have Social Security in America? Why do we still have Medicare? Why do so many countries have universal healthcare system and childcare subsidies, and often universal education grants and public education systems? And it seems like the argument is that the capitalists, that they're all powerful and they hate all these welfare things, and they're going to take them away. And it's like, well, okay, but why is the public school system over 100 years old, right? Why do these things seem to last? Now, the answer from Astar Bayer, when I really pushed him on it, was, well, you can only get away with so much as a capitalist, which seems to imply that everyday people and workers do have the power to, in this capitalist system, leverage their vote and their ideologies and maintain robustly systems that they like. And so if that's the case, the capitalist class isn't actually all powerful and all moving. It's actually kind of a mixed system where, sure, if you're a billionaire, you do have an outsized influence on a democratic system. I don't like that, but it seems like many countries have been able to regulate that pretty effectively insofar as the median voter is very, very well represented. And in pretty much every single developed country, that is the case, right? And in many developing countries, that is the case, that the median person, even though it's a capitalist system, seems to be pretty well represented. But again, let's see if he comes up with, good studies or empirics or something on this. Let's see how he defends this claim, because I've looked into it before and it just doesn't seem very well bore out.
Under social democracy, capital retains tremendous power, which it can use in things like capital strikes. A capital strike, like a labor strike, happens when capital refuses to work. Except capitalists don't actually work, so really a capital strike is when capitalists refuse to invest, sitting on their hands and piles of cash, and or deciding to move their capital to another country in what's called capital flight. Because social democratic societies protect the sanctity of private capital like all capitalist societies do, meaning that they are very apprehensive of expropriating capital even in times of crisis where literally one person can screw over hundreds of others, social democracies are incredibly vulnerable to backpedaling. When capitalists get a whiff of progressive social policies that could hurt their bottom line, like an upcoming set of nationalizations, minimum wage increases, a shortening of the work week, more holidays, public healthcare, or anything else that makes life better for everyone but makes big companies less money, capital just sits it out and sends the economy into a tailspin.
This is all completely ahistorical. Let's one by one. He says minimum wages. Well, across the world, minimum wages seem to meteorically increase over time, not decrease. I can't think of a single example of a developing country plainly decreasing their minimum wage because of pressure from capital interests. Maybe there are examples, but I can't think of any, right? He mentions, what was the other thing? He mentions the public healthcare system. Well, again, in every developed country except for the US, there's pretty robust universal healthcare systems that have stood the test of time. I mean, the NHS in England is 90 years old or something like that at this point. It's a very old system at this point, and it's the same thing with many other countries in the world. The fundamental principle of free at the point of service healthcare has been maintained at so many of these other systems, or there's countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands that have pretty robust universal private health insurance, but it's pretty good insurance. Again, the US is a example where we don't have a universal healthcare system, but again, that's the exception, not really the rule. What are the other things he mentioned?
That makes life better. Minimum wage increases, a shortening of the work week, more
shortening of the work week. I can't recall a country that's gone to a 6-day work week because of capital interest. Oh, the big headline, Sweden moves to a 6-7 day work week because of capital interest, right? Where has that happened before? I can't think of examples of that. Let's see.
More holidays, public healthcare.
More holidays. Okay, so an example where a country has gotten rid of a national or federal holiday because the capital interest says, look, I get it. We just can't have you work on Christmas because it's regulation, but we got to get away with it. We need that production on Christmas Day. Where does that happen? Again, there's no examples being listed here. He's just saying these things capital gets rid of, but in every single example, capital apparently hasn't been able to get rid of it, right? So, come on. The NHS is 75 years old. Only 75? I thought the NHS came around right after World War II. That's like 80 years ago, right? Maybe I'm wrong.
Or anything else that makes life better for everyone but makes big companies less money, capital just sits it out and sends the economy into a tailspin. Suffice it to say that governments would prefer to avoid this situation, so progressive legislation is curtailed before it's even started. And in the cases where social democratic states take the gamble and capitalists respond with a strike, social democratic governments find themselves unable to take control of the production process themselves and are forced to
Give an example. Give an example. I just don't understand why he's not getting... There are actually examples of welfare systems being rolled back in one way or another. Now, I would say that those examples are few and far in between, and the broad trend is that we have more and more social spending over time. But again, this is such a lazy argument. He's not even giving any potential examples. And this last example that he gave...
respond with a strike. Social democratic governments find themselves unable to take control of the production process themselves and are forced to appease capitalists by screwing over workers and imposing austerity politics. What's great about this...
Right, he says that social democratic governments are unable to take over production. Well, I mean, if that's the issue, then it seems like socialism might not work. If you're saying that governments are not able to take over production from these capitalist enterprises, well, maybe that's potentially some utility of these capitalist enterprises. But at the end of the day, though, I just need some examples that we can at least fire back on. Other than that, he's just saying things that people want to hear, but there's no actual evidence behind them. I mean, come on now.
This process, from the capitalist point of view, is that it happens almost automatically. In a capitalist economy, the government always has to make sure that its economy is hospitable to profit-making, and therefore investment. This means that capitalists don't necessarily need to be occupying government positions or even be conscious of what they're doing. They just need to know that if the government does something they don't like, they can put their money elsewhere or stop investing. And the government knows that if it does something that lowers investments, their economy might suffer. Each actor can act with relative autonomy from one another, but because they are doing so within the same set of rules, maximizing profits for the capitalist class, they'll often naturally come to an agreement that keeping poverty around and forcing people into mind-numbing work most days of the week and most waking hours of the day is what's best for the economy. Add to that fact that capitalists can influence the government more directly by becoming elected members within it comparatively easily, financing the campaigns of people who are friendly to their interests, or owning mass media institutions that parrot.
He's like, capitalists have so much power in our political system, points to a failed presidential candidate, points to another failed presidential candidate, Ted Cruz. Oh, but capitalists have so much power, they can fund all these failed presidential candidates. Yeah, of course. There's such a powerful cog in the machine of democratic, liberal democratic countries. Look, all these failed presidential candidates they wasted billions of dollars on. Yes, so much power, unbelievable. Oh no, gotta turn the volume back on.
And you realize how vulnerable social democracy is by keeping capitalist power around. Not to belabor the point, but 1% of people holding the other 99% hostage by threatening to stop financing the economy when things don't go their way isn't democracy. In contrast, the socialist response of running the economy without capitalists by bringing investment into democratic hands avoids this problem domestically. Socialists still run into the problem of what to do about international capital, but this is something that can be solved by the collaboration of multiple socialist economies, so it's not insurmountable. Social democracy, however, has neither the domestic nor the international means to respond to a capitalist backlash. And this isn't just a theoretical weakness of social democracy. It's been seen in practice many times, and we're even seeing it today. Back in the 80s, for example, France elected François Mitterrand to be its president. Mitterrand sailed into the presidency on the promise of being a radical social democrat, bringing the mixed economy model to France with the surprising backing of the Communist Party. He did all the things I listed earlier: raised the minimum wage, nationalized a few industries, gave people more holidays and a shorter work week, raised pensions, invested in high-speed rail, all sorts of good stuff that made people's lives meaningfully better almost overnight. But just 2 years in, capital responded. Foreign and domestic investments dried up, and Mitterrand had to completely reverse course in what was called the austerity turn. Multiple nationalized industries were reprivatized, public spending on things like social security was massively cut, and new taxes were imposed on workers. It was a brutal blow to the French working class, and a total betrayal of the promises that Mitterrand got elected on. And Sweden's gone down the same path, just a bit more slowly and more recently.
Good lord, I mean, has anyone ever worked with anybody who works in France? It's unbelievable all the benefits that French workers get. Like, I've heard multiple people say, like, oh god, it's a little bit difficult to work with French workers because they get a week's vacation every 4 weeks or something ridiculous, right? Now, to be fair, that might not be universal. I mean, the old saying that I heard was that, you get up in the morning and your lights are out because the electric workers in France are on strike, and then you go down to the street to take the bus, but you can't because the transit workers in France are on strike, and then you start walking to the grocery store to get a bottle of milk or water, and you can't because the grocery store is on strike, and then you get to your job and it turns out that everyone at your company is also on strike, right? It seems like in France they do protesting and strikes pretty damn well. And again, in France, they've got a universal healthcare system. I'm not sure what the state enterprise system looks like over in France, but they've got relatively low income inequality, and they also have some social democratic type systems, universal education and stuff like that. So even in that example, I'm not sure it's clear that the capitalist influence has killed the social democratic reforms of these countries. And I guess he mentions, Sweden is on the same. I don't know why he's picking out Sweden particularly. Like, Sweden's on the same path, just slower. I think that Sweden's broadly followed the same trend of increasing social ownership and also social spending. So I don't know. I'm just not. This seems very unconvincing so far. Let's see. We can go to. Let's see. This is kind of what I'm talking about, right? You look at this graph of like these different developed countries, right? I guess let's look at France. He mentions France. He says, "Oh, those darn When was this guy elected? France socialist president. I'm not sure." He says Mitterrand was elected in 81 to 95. Okay, first of all, this dude was president for a long time. He was president for like 14 years. I thought this was going to be an example of like, he was president for 2 years and then resigns in disgrace or something. So he's president for a long time. He was president is 81 to 95. So let's see. 1980, 81. Okay, let's see. Oh, we skipped from 8. Let's just say 80. Okay, so 80, France spends 20% of their economy on social spending. And then by 95, France spends 28%. So the proportion of their economy dedicated to social services alone, forget about national industry, forget about unionization, forget about democratic structure in the workplace, just their social spending on social programs in the economy went from 20 to 28%, right? So that's almost a 50% increase in the proportion of the economy dedicated to social services. You can see some of the definitions above. This includes health, old age, incapacity-related benefits, people with disabilities, family, active labor market programs, unemployment, housing. The spending on those things increased by 50% under this president. And then going forward, it's increased all the way to 32%, which is, what is that? That's more than a fit. That's like a 60% increase in the proportion of the economy from when this guy took office to today, right? But oh God, the capitalists just destroyed all of these systems, right? Because there were a few reprivatizations, all of a sudden, none of this matters. Now, some people might point out, well, social spending as a share of GDP, I mean, socialism is about production, right? Social spending on things like disability benefits, that's not necessarily socialism. Sure, that's fair enough. It's just that Second Thought is the one using them as examples, saying, oh, well, the fact that pensions got cut and things like this happen, that's an example of how social democracy is bad, but it appears like social democratic welfare seems to be pretty robust over time. After all, we're only looking at France, but this is obviously a graph of like 10 different developed countries. These are pretty much from what I can see, the biggest developed countries in the world. I mean, even look at the United States, right? The United States is a country almost defined internationally by how terrible our benefits are and how terrible our welfare systems are. And you can see we rank quite a bit lower than all of these other countries. France is actually number 1 in this instance. But again, the trend over time since basically 1930 is perfectly linear, basically, right? There are some instances where it might go down year to year, but again, the broad trend seems to be that it increases significantly. So, I'm not, and again, look at the trend of this whole graph. Basically, it's virtually the same trend since 1930. It seems like social spending has increased significantly, and I'm not sure how that's possible in a world where capitalists are both all-powerful and also hate all the dang welfare we give all these workers. If they're all-powerful and they hate it, I'm not sure why these graphs look virtually linear across the aggregation of all these developed countries, and the answer is yes. If you were to add more and more countries to this, I think that the broad trend ends up being the same. Here, let's add basically every country that they have available to us in this Our World in Data set. Okay, so we've added basically all the countries we can, and you can see even when adding all of these different countries, the broad trend seems to stay the exact same, right? It seems like pretty much every country in the world is increasing the amount that they're spending on people who are unable to work, people with disabilities, old age people, healthcare people, or healthcare spending, stuff like that, unemployment, active labor market policies, and housing. It seems like the spending on those things is going up and up and up, right? And it's a very empirical sort of argument that some people make that, the country of France, the capitalists have taken over, and that's why the social spending programs are perpetually cut. Well, if that's so, why does France have the highest amount of public social spending in the world as a proportion of their economy? I mean, come on, guys. Let's, use numbers. Use numbers here.
Article in Forbes, just so you know I'm not using socialist sources here. Over the past 2 decades, the country has undergone a transformation built on deregulation and budget self-restraint with cuts to Sweden's welfare state. Sweden's government shrank jobless and disability benefits to encourage employment. The lower
benefits allowed for tax cuts. The inheritance tax was scrapped in 2005 and the wealth tax was canned 2 years later. A new bill lowered the energy tax on data centers by 97%. They had an energy tax on data centers.
It's allowed for tax cuts. The inheritance tax was scrapped in 2005, and the wealth tax was canned 2 years later. The result? Inequality in Sweden has skyrocketed. Quoting not from Forbes this time, in 2002, Sweden's top 1% owned 18% of all household wealth. By 2017, it had risen to 42%. And quote,
yeah, but let's just do a dive into Sweden real quick. Sweden, income inequality. He's really picking on Sweden here. I'm not sure why. I guess because maybe people use Sweden as an example of of all these cool social democratic programs, but I'm not. I guess when I think of like the most robust social democratic system, I think of Norway, not necessarily Sweden. So let's see, inequality of disposable income. Sweden, still a lot less than the US, still a lot less than OECD. It's been increasing since 1990. Redistribution, inequality of market income, inequality of disposable income. And it seems like Sweden's still pretty low in that regard. And I think something that's worth pointing out, if we look at taxes as a percent of GDP, the OECD is going to have some good stats in this regard. Well, I need the Swedish stats over time. GDP, Sweden. Oh, they cut all these taxes and implemented austerity. Well, let's see if that's true. Let's see if we can get a trend over time and see if Sweden's really just completely destroyed their fiscal situation. Let's see, ranked OECD members, Sweden from 2000 to 2021. I don't know, guys. That looks like a pretty stable trend to me. Looks like there was about 50% in 2000 all the way to 42% in, 2021. Still some of the highest in the world. I mean, I don't know. I'm not seeing super huge cuts. Not a lot of room for super duper huge cuts there.
The country's poorest 30% have no net wealth at all, merely net debts. This is what makes the difference between social democracy and socialism. At any given time, the economy can crumble not because of a natural disaster, a global pandemic, a sudden shortage, a war, a military coup, or a lost election, but just because things got too good for everyday people and they weren't as exploitable as before. To resist these tendencies takes tremendous political will, tremendous social engagement, and extremely high unionization, things that can be chipped away at for years by capitalists and that can easily go out the window when the end of the month is looking lean. It's not that social democracy isn't better than what we're currently living through in the US. It undeniably is. Making the US follow the Nordic model would ease the burden on millions of people overnight. The problem is that if we ever get that, it will always contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and will demand from us that we continue to brutally exploit our fellow human beings on the other side of the world. This doesn't mean socialism is better by default. I'll let my other videos and those of other great creators on this website make the case for that. But when it comes to these problems, socialism has the answer. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that my channel is only possible thanks to my patrons on Patreon. As some of you may...
we haven't defined what socialism is anyway, but no, I mean, I guess I just disagree. There's very little empirics. I mean, this is one of the frustrations that I think a lot of creators have. I mean, for me, I don't feel this as much. Like, some people will tell me, like, oh, it sucks you don't get as many views as other people, and it's like, yeah, but I mean, I create the content that I want to watch, and the content I want to watch is somewhat boring. But unfortunately, the content that does get a ton of views is content that's kind of like this, it's pretty light in empirics, pretty light in analysis. Yes, this thing is just true, and I'm explaining it, and you're believing me because you're a fan of me, and I have to do no actual work or anything like that, right? And it's a little upsetting because if you actually go more in depth and make a more evidence-based case on that, then people aren't as interested in that kind of thing. But the reality is that if we really take the claims and the evidence backing them in this video, internal to this video, it's not really there, right? And even when I debated a doctorate in economics professor who again, you'd figure would have a pretty good empirical backing of all the claims he makes, didn't really seem like it was there. Not from Ostar Bayer at the very least. Not from all the socialists that I've spoken to. Not even Vosh, right? That was the first discussion I had with Vosh, was about the Global South and exploitation in the Global South, and he just didn't know what he was talking about, right? About in that regard, right? And all the respect to Vosh, I guess, but it is a little frustrating when you really do have good arguments for the systems you advocate for, but the extremity, I guess, in how we apply the solution is not really justified based on the problem. Because if we analyze the problem in a fitted way, I don't think we'd come around to the decision that, yes, all private capital allocation should be abolished and we should have no profit motive in the economy, right? I think you'd come to, probably a bit of a more moderate solution in that regard, which is, yeah, I mean, having some pretty heavy unionization, collective ownership, and, a pretty robust, democratically accountable regulatory state. Yeah, that pretty much fixes the problems that we're talking about here, right? And The degree to which we should have collective ownership is kind of a, kind of a try and see sort of thing, right? And how do we determine the models of collective ownership are interesting, but again, the at the end of the day, though, this is just not a very good video that doesn't present a lot of evidence for relatively extraordinary claims that even a cursory Google search would lead you to, find that, well, it turns out this isn't actually true, that, public pensions and social welfare programs have just been cut because those darn evil capitalists don't like it, right? So, I don't know. I wish there were better videos like that got more views, but, until then, I guess, we'll just have to reply to videos like this, and hopefully most people can understand that it's not entirely reality what this person is saying. So let's see. Boy, I know you like the Finnish education system, but how would you fix their gender gap in education? I'm not familiar with their gender gap in education. You have to link me to something about that. Boy, what YouTube channels do you think do a good job of presenting fair analysis of economic questions? I would say a lot of them don't get into the more political questions, but I would say that Yuri from Money and Macro does a pretty good job. I think Unlearning Economics is cool to listen to. Matt Bruning, who started doing YouTube channel videos, I should say. I mean, his channel is pretty interesting. I've been watching like all his videos recently, so that's pretty. And then obviously, your boy, Econoboy. So let's see. Political Economy 101. That is why that's why you're not worth talking to. The evidence won't change your mind. I'm not sure what you mean, Political Economy 101. What is some evidence that you think would change my mind that I am simply ignoring? If you can point that out to me, then I will gladly concede that you're right. Mainstream economics is boring and requires a ton of research. Do a video on productivity and intangible capital. Go full boring. I think my channel is already pretty damn full boring. I mean, I pretty much just do the content that I want to do. And that tends to be somewhat boring, so at least boring in a relative sense. Obviously, you guys are watching me and I enjoy the videos I make, but of course, everyone's different. So there it is, though. There it is. Second thought video analysis. Hope everyone enjoyed that one.